Thank you, Craig. There's the Revos. So we're now entering in our history process, going through history. We're entering what's called the early modern period. We may not think of it as modern, but it's the period that anticipates all of the characteristics of the modern era. And the modern era, which is really the 19th, 20th century, and now 21st century, is a time of increasing choice. Increasing choice. We were born, all of us, into the era that was most replete with choices for people. Never before in history before the 20th century had people had as many choices in their lives as our generations. We take it for granted because we were born into it. And in fact, most of us know this because most of our relatives chose to leave wherever they were, right? Wherever they were situated, they're either your parents, your grandparents, they chose to leave. They migrated. During most of history, that was not possible. Hello, Cantor. It was not possible to migrate. There was nowhere to go. And if you went there, it was worse often than where you were. And you were not necessarily invited in or welcome in those places. During most of history, up till the modern period, almost all people lived and died within 50 miles of where they were born. And we have to really take that in, what that means as a life. It not only means that you don't really get to choose what you're going to do with your life, that is, you're probably going to do what your parents did. If your father was a butcher, it's a good chance you're going to be a butcher. You're going to marry someone like your father. You're going to have, if your mother had 10 children, you're going to try and have 10 children, or how many ever are alive, because many will die along the way. Many of you still know stories in your family of grandparents or great-grandparents who had many, many children, and many of them died. And you talk about the ones that lived beyond childhood. And in fact, there were two main sources of death, and it's why it kept the average life expectancy so low. Average life expectancy during the Middle Ages was somewhere between 28 and 32. And the reason for that was because of medical issues, women dying in childbirth, babies dying of diseases, people getting cuts and infections that they had no way to treat it. So then there were diseases like the Black Death and many other, like what the pandemic did to us. America lost over 1 million lives to the pandemic, and we came up with a vaccine. So, you know, you can't even imagine what it was like when a disease like that hit some of the cities in Europe. It literally wiped out 30 to 50% of the city. And that means everywhere you went were dead bodies. Everywhere. The street, and they had no sewage. So it was filthy. There were rats everywhere. There was disease everywhere. There were rotting bodies. They couldn't bury them fast enough. And the second thing was war. We've been living in the most peaceful time in world history. We take it for granted. But all you have to do is remember World War II and World War I, which was right before us, right? That period was typical of what the 19th century was and all the centuries before it. There were wars going on everywhere. They broke out constantly. They lasted for often years, and they didn't necessarily resolve. Or if they resolved, what they did was lots of people died. Lots of soldiers, men, right? And families and people who were just living around lost their ability to earn enough money. And so starvation set in. And they didn't have the option to move. Those options didn't exist. So it's what kept the populations situated in one place and kept the population lower. We have the other problem. We live in the most affluent era of all of history. We live in the most literate period, the most medically sophisticated period, and we've lived through a very peaceful period. I know it doesn't seem that right at this moment, because we're thinking about the Ukrainian war and we get news all the time, and we've just seen over 20,000 people die in an earthquake. But that happened all the time, all over the world, but there was no news outlet. So people weren't aware of it. You know, it took something like 3 weeks for England to learn that President Lincoln had been shot. You know, this is a different world that we live in than any other period. So we're coming now out of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries into what's called the early modern period, that which will begin the process that will bring us to where we are. It's a slow process because it takes hundreds of years to get us here. But one of the most important factors is the printing press, movable type, right? When movable type exists for the first time in the 15th century, things can be published more cheaply and they don't have to be scribed by hand. And they can run off many copies, and those copies can be distributed. And people start to learn to read because they have something to read, right? It's not, the books were very valuable, it was expensive. They didn't exist in many places. They were only in certain repositories, and most people didn't have access to them. But once we had a printing press with movable type, we could start printing things. So that kind of ushered in the beginnings of the modern era. And it started to transform the way people thought and started to stimulate people's thinking about possibilities. Before that, they didn't think about the options, about thinking about possibilities. They accepted what their parents told them. They accepted what the church told them. They accepted what the feudal lords told them. They accepted their lot. It was what God had ordained for them. They believed that. And they lived their lives that way. It's hard for us to put our mindset into theirs, right? Because we don't buy any of that. We were raised with choice. I often think, when I think about choice, I don't know how many of you had the opportunity to visit the Soviet Union or behind the Iron Curtain before the curtain fell in 89 through 91. But when I was there, the first time I was there was in around 1980, 81. I was in Poland, and then I went to the Soviet Union to visit refuseniks. And I went into Poland. I remember going into a store and looking at the store and seeing what was in there. And there were like two kinds of cereal. There was oat cereal and wheat cereal, one box of each. And if they had copies of it, you could buy one of them, right? But they didn't always. Sometimes they just had it sitting there and you would ask for it and they would say, it's not here. We're waiting for a shipment. That was it. When Soviet Jews came to the United States, the biggest shock they had, some of us remember, was when they walked into our supermarkets. And there were reports of the Soviet Jews walking to the aisle of breakfast cereals and being frozen in their tracks and not knowing what to do. They were absolutely stunned. They didn't know what to do. There were so many varieties, so many differences. They didn't know how to choose. It wasn't oats and wheat. It was, you know what it is. It was an entire row and levels of it, of choices. And for you and me, we walk down there as if we know everything that's going on. We know what we're going to choose. We know what we're looking for. They didn't know. That was the world. The world before them didn't even have 2 boxes of cereal. They only had grain, if they could get it. And they had to use the grain and make it into something. If they were lucky, there was an oven and a baker who would, and you could use his oven in order to bake bread, right? Because not every house had ovens. Some did, some didn't. Okay. So we're now moving into Europe. And the reason we're moving into Europe is that Europe embraced the printing press in a way that the Middle East and the Asian world did not. Europe embraced it partly because it was founded on Christianity. We have to talk about Christianity a little more. I talked about it last time we met, but I want to focus a little more on it. Christianity grew out of Judaism. We all know that, right? Jesus was born in a Jewish environment, lived and died in a Jewish area with Jews surrounding him and Romans, right? Pagans and Jews. The Christianity that came out after Jesus died was a religion that took certain aspects of Judaism, but rejected major processes in Judaism. And it saw itself as the successor corporation. Christianity called itself the New Israel in its early writings, the new chosen people, and called the Jews the rejected people of God. The Bible we call the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, was the Old Testament that God no longer saw as valid, and the New Testament superseded the Old. That's a very important notion, because from early Christianity, they believed Judaism should disappear. God rejected us. Why are we still here? If God wants to get rid of us, why are we still here? Makes no sense, right? Well, so they came up with philosophies that showed the Jews were here to show that God had rejected us. So we were the despised. We had to be kept in the poorest area. We had to be restricted from everything we could do. We had to be kept economically constrained. We had to be shown as humiliation. So we had to wear special hats and special stars or circles at different times to distinguish us. And the distinguishing meant that we were the rejected of God. All right? Islam didn't have that problem. Islam didn't see us as the rejected of God. Islam saw us as part of Abraham's tradition, just like Ishmael was their strain. We were Isaac. So we were cousins. We were not as elevated because we didn't accept Muhammad's teaching, but we weren't despised. We weren't rejected. We were just at a lower level. So we could be tolerated. There were restrictions. We couldn't build our synagogues too fancy. We had to walk in areas lower than Muslims. There were things we had to do to humiliate us a little, but they didn't kill us all the time, and they didn't oppress us all the time. But Christianity had a theological problem with us. And so they periodically had to deal with us. And periodically a group would rise up to say, Jews have to convert. Enough of this craziness. We can't tolerate them anymore. They rejected Christ. They rejected God. Time to reject them. So all kinds of terrible things constantly happen to us under Christianity. And Christianity was based as well on illiteracy. The Christian system kept its people illiterate. That was a decision. I don't know if you know this, but you know why churches have beautiful stained glass? That was part of the Christianity's approach toward teaching the Bible stories. It was like having a picture book on the walls. That's what it was. So when the priest would teach about the Good Samaritan, the priest would say, look at that picture of the Good Samaritan and Jesus. Look at it. And then he would preach about that. Right? But nobody in his flock knew how to read and write. The only ones that knew how to read and write were the priests themselves, the people who served the church in Catholicism, and some of the scribes, who usually were priests also, but not always, and the aristocrats who had the money, and the priests would educate them. And remember last week I said there were two bases for power in the Christian world. There was the government, which largely were the aristocrats, and there was the church. And they worked sometimes together, sometimes vying with each other. Okay. Judaism, on the other hand, was a literate tradition going back to the Talmud and the Mishnah. We taught our people how to read and write and do math. Our people knew how to read the Torah. Our people knew how to read the Mishnah, at least parts of it. We knew how to read. That was a big advantage. But it also meant that the Christian world often had to rely on us to do stuff they needed done, particularly in the business world and tax collecting. But that also made us the vulnerable middle people, because the Christians had rejected us, and yet we served a purpose. But sometimes that purpose was to be a scapegoat for the wealthy, who could point to us as the ones oppressing the poor. Now, we generally know this, but things changed with the printing press. For the first time, Christians started to think, to read. They could read the Bible. Bibles got published in the vernacular eventually. They could read. They knew the stories now. They saw the contradictions. They saw that what the church was teaching isn't necessarily true. And that was the Protestant Reformation, right? They started rejecting the authority of the church and started saying, wait a minute, we can interpret. Why are we dependent on them? And authority began to break down. Okay, so I'm going to share with you now our timeline, and we're going to go through a little of this in order to kind of highlight certain things. So here we are in the end of the 12th century. In the city of York in England, a pogrom happened and Jews were massacred. So in the next century, this was a terrible period. So King Henry III expelled us from England. I just want to show you, this is the end of the Middle Ages. But what happens here? 1290, we get expelled again from England because Jews came back. Because we were needed, other kings later brought us back. Why did we come back? We came back because it was our best option. As bad as it had been, it was worse for us wherever we went. So when we were invited back with better terms. So we came, and look what happened again. We got expelled again. But this time we were expelled for 400 years from England. We didn't get back until after Shakespeare was dead. However, let's move to the 14th century. Look at 1304 here. Jews are repeatedly expelled from France and readmitted for a price. Look at the dates, the entire century. We have at least 8 or 10 times Jews were expelled from France and then brought back in. Again, why did we come back? Because we didn't have anywhere better to go. It's hard for us to understand this, but that was the Jewish world. We were constantly being played by the powers that be. This involved the church and it involved the governments. So what happened? Look at 1343. This is some of the reading that I gave you. I hope that you got to some of it. I know it was a lot. Sorry, but this is the period that most of us trace our ancestors to, when our people got to Eastern Europe. Most of us come from that area, and even Germany. So here, Jews get invited into Poland. Why are we invited into Poland? Because Casimir the Great sees that Jews can be advantageous to him. They help people of wealth by being the middle people. And so they're invited in. Now, at the same time, other things are going on. There are massacres. This is an interesting piece I wanted to show you. It's not part of what I want to talk to you about, but it's an interesting thing. Look at 1350s. Something seemed to have happened in Germany, in the Ashkenazic area, where there were very few people living there at that time. And because there were very few and they intermarried, it seems that that's where we get some of our markings genetically as Ashkenazim, because they had so few choices to marry. At least that's the theory right now. Okay, so let's move on. I'm trying to move us toward our modern period. Here we are. You can see we're still being expelled from many areas and from German cities. And now we get to the 16th century. So there was a period when Jews had been expelled from parts of Poland. And again, we come back in. Same time, you have massacres going on elsewhere. But here, look at the printing press. 1511, Jewish books are now being mechanically pressed. By the way, Daniel Bomberg is not Jewish. But one of the first books published is the Hebrew Bible, because Jews want it and they'll pay for it. And because we had middlemen who had a bit of wealth, that they could do that. Now here we see in Poland, Jews, the king of Poland, this is Sigismund, we read about him, abolished the law that Jews have to wear special clothes. So things are getting better in Poland, they're getting worse elsewhere. That's one of the reasons we stayed in Poland. Look at this. First Hebrew Jewish printing house in Lublin. And Jews are expelled from Genoa, Italy. Same time. All right? Look at this. First yeshiva founded in Poland. Right? And then a session, the first session of the Council of the Four Lands in Lublin, Poland. We're allowed to have our own internal government. That's Poland. Look at it, it's going on through the 18th century. Poland was a good place to be Jewish relative to the world. Okay, I want to stop for a minute and ask if anybody has any questions or anything you want to bring up before we move on. If you want to just unmute and let me know. I can't see all of you. Okay. If you haven't interrupted me, you can't. Oh, Mark, you're going to say something?
Well, I guess we're following the Ashkenazi history. And of course, I noticed Rabbi Moses Cordovero and the Ari and Sfat. So there's another stream going on as well.
Yeah, well, last week we dealt more with the Sephardic world.
Okay.
No, and that world in some ways settles into a more stable pattern. That doesn't mean it's wonderful, but it's not the kind of upheavals that we see in the Christian world. In the Muslim world, things settle down and they kind of have a longer term. After all the upheavals in Spain and Portugal, things now going south to North Africa and the Middle East, all that area begins to just become settled. Jewish communities there will have consistency. That doesn't mean they're not attacked ever, but it means that by and large they live their lives, in a stable environment. Yep. The opposite is going on in much of Europe. Things are percolating all over. And that's why that the Muslim world did not experience modernity until the 19th century. Really, the Muslim world stayed in the Middle Ages until the 19th and 20th centuries, right? Europe, the printing press hit Europe, and it started percolating all around Europe. And eventually it upset all kinds of things, including the revolutions, the French Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, eventually revolutions all over in the 19th century. And then the destructions of the empires in the 20th century, right? All of this was happening and it flowed, but it took time. We're going to focus now we're focusing on Europe. So, because
Rabbi,
I'm sorry, yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
So the Jews were immigrating into Poland. Where were they coming from? England? If they weren't coming from, were they from the Inquisition Jews moving from Spain, or were they from other European countries?
Well, largely they were coming from other European countries. Most of the Inquisition Jews had moved toward Italy, Turkey, Netherlands, Belgium to some degree. That's kind of where they settled. And then the ones in Germany, in areas south of Germany, Austria, Hungary, all of those areas, as anti-Semitism, what we would call anti-Semitism, pogroms, or when they were expelled, or the French Jews, ultimately they had to move somewhere, and Poland had welcomed them. The English Jews got expelled already at the end of the 13th century. So they already were integrated wherever they were going to be by the time we see Poland becoming more of an alternative. Some of them moved there, but that was kind of a center. It's why we see so many of our ancestors coming out of that part of the world. It's where we found a more stable life. Again, more stable is relative, right? We have to remember this period is a terrible time in some ways to be a Jew. In some ways, it's better than being a peasant, a Christian peasant, because they were poorer, they were illiterate largely, most of them. They were under the thumb of leaders who oppressed them. We at least had some tools to survive. Many of the peasants didn't. Any other comments or questions? Okay, I'm going to go back to our timeline. So here, why do we suddenly see false messiahs in the 17th century? So part of what's happened, we talked last week about it, is in the 11th century, around the year 1000, the church had been promulgating this notion that Jesus would come back. Jesus didn't come back and redeem the world. The fallout from that were the Crusades. We have to redeem the world of Jesus's life, that is the Holy Land, from Islam. 2 or 3 centuries later, Islam was still ensconced in the world of where Jesus was born and lived, the Holy Land. So what's the other reason that Jesus isn't coming back? Because of all these Jews. So you had all these pogroms that were, or expulsions of Jews. Well, Jews were feeling desperate. There must be something we're doing wrong. We're doing something wrong. How can we find a way to satisfy God? Because Jews believed that the reason we were being punished was because of our sins. That's how we absorbed the pain. We said all of this is going on because of our sins. We've got to make ourselves better. We got to find a way to make this happen. Now I want to show you this. Look here at 1648. Look at the population of Poland. Look at it compared to the worldwide population of Jews. Worldwide, there are less than 1 million Jews in the world in the 17th century. And more than half of them are in Poland. Right? There's a reason for that. So, you know, Mark, if we're talking about the Jews under Islam, it's a relatively small group. Look, you've got 40,000 Bohemia, 25,000 Moravia. You got Jews, you know, so there are Jews in France, and by now there are Jews in England as well, but most of them are in the area we call Poland. But look what happens in 1648 to 55. There is this guy called Chmielnicki. Nice looking guy, huh? So he leads the Polish gentry to slaughter Jews and Polish gentry. He leads the Ukrainian Cossacks to slaughter Polish gentry and Jews. So think about the impact of 450,000 Jews losing 65,000 in a few years by basically swords, by being slaughtered by swords, right? Every family. So there was a panic. Into this came this guy Shabtai Tzvi, who was a mystic. And he was of Sephardic origin. He was in the world and he claimed to be the Messiah. And because these Jews in Poland were so afraid, tens of thousands of them packed their suitcases, their bags, their duffels, and they followed to Shabtai Tzvi. And they said, we're one of you. Now, I don't know if you read, we're not going to talk much about Shabtai Tzvi because I gave you stuff to read about him, but he obviously was a false Messiah, but he's the most famous false Messiah. And even after he converted to Islam, right, some of his followers still followed him. They converted with him. They thought Shabtai Tzvi, we're going to stay with him because he's our Messiah. And that crazy notion of false Messiah now became a standard subtext for part of the modern world. It was one of the ways that Jews could explain what we need to do in order to placate God, who is punishing us. By the way, as a side, Ukrainians, you all know the mixed history of Ukraine with Jews. The Cossacks here were the same Cossacks who worked with the Nazis and were among the worst oppressors of Jews during the Holocaust and previous to that. However, the Ukraine of today doesn't seem to be the Ukraine of yesterday. And so we seem to be changing our attitude toward the modern Ukraine, because just like with Germany, today's Germany is not the Germany of World War II and the previous period. Okay. So here we have the readmission of into England with Oliver Cromwell. This was an earthquake, by the way, right? Sfat is on the earthquake line, is on the fault line. It just didn't hit this time. And it's built better now as well, by the way. So look what the consequence was in the 18th century. We have the Hasidic tradition. Why does it rise? Well, maybe what we've been doing by studying Talmud and being super strict is not what God wants. Maybe what God wants is for us to be joyous. What God wants is for us to go out into God's nature and celebrate God in song, in each other, in joy. Maybe we need to follow not false messiahs, but great Hasidic leaders who can work miracles. And Hasidism is an answer, as false messianism is an answer to what's going on, to all the terrible things that have been happening. Because we also, I skipped it, but I mentioned earlier the Black Plague. When the Black Plague attacked Europe and Jews were blamed in many communities, the reason Jews were blamed, some say it's because we washed our hands before eating, right? Some say it's because of kashrut. We only ate certain kinds of food. Some say it's because of the mikvah, that we used water to bathe in, and very few others bathed. We don't really know, but we do know that Jewish communities were not hit as hard as Christian communities. We were still killed by Black Plague, by bubonic plague, but not to the same degree as Christian communities. And the Christians looked at us and said, aha, they're doing it to us. So then they killed us and blamed us for poisoning the wells. So this was a really terrible time, and it came in waves, wave after wave. And remember what I started with, we didn't have a lot of options. Where were we going to go? Right? Other than Poland, and Poland now had this Khmelnytsky massacre, where were we going to go? We couldn't just get on a ship and go to the New World. The New World was nothing. It was not a place that was an option. We couldn't go to Palestine because there was no economic means to make a living there. They were starving there too. And they didn't speak our languages. We spoke, in Europe, we spoke Yiddish, we spoke Polish, we spoke Ukrainian, right? We didn't speak Arabic. We didn't speak Ladino. What were we going to do down there? How would we live? Let alone take our lives in our hands and go on some verstunken ship and go off to some desert area called the New World, which was just being founded, right? Okay, so what was another option? Well, look at this, 18th century. the Enlightenment movement, right? To bring Jews into the culture of the Western world, to blend, this is Moses Mendelssohn, to blend Judaism with the modern world. Let's become more like them. We'll still be Jewish, but we'll revive our traditions, and we will take on the dress of Christians. We'll build our synagogues to look like churches, and we'll become one of them as equals, but will remain distinct. Right? Now, this shows that one of the paths, Mendelssohn, you know of Mendelssohn's sons and his grandchildren, they all converted to Christianity. And that was part of what happened here, because those were the unforeseen circumstances. You know what I mean? Mendelssohn didn't know that the end result of becoming like them at that time meant that his children would say, well, if we went halfway, why not all the way? What's so bad about being a Christian? Is that so terrible? Look how the Christians are living. We can go to a university. We can get doctorates. We can become musicians. As you know, we can get our music published and played by orchestras. We can go into the arts. We can go into medicine. And look what happens. Jews are finally permitted into the colonies by England. Now, there were Jews there already that had come from Spain and Portugal via South America. I told you that from Recife, they had moved up into New Amsterdam. So there have been Jews since the 1650s, around 1654, as when we first got there, for 100 years or so. But in the English colonies, it was more difficult. So now England allowed that. So now Jews were having options. Do you see what I said at the beginning? There were no options. And the modern era began to offer options. Options for Jews to find new places to go, to get away from all of the terrors that were going on in Europe. Okay, we'll take a minute and talk a little. Okay, questions or comments about what's going on? So how about your families? When did they start moving around? What do you know of your families and when did they move? I know Mark had a branch that went to Palestine, right, Mark?
Yeah, that was in the 1860s and 70s, driven by the assassination of Tsar Alexander. The Karen's family went to America in the 1840s from England. They were the Enlightened and Germany. So a branch went to Virginia and another branch went to North Carolina.
Right.
And then another set of family went to Brazil.
Right. Though, you know, next week we'll actually get into the 19th century. Not next week, 2 weeks. Next week is Rabbi Kronish. We're doing I'm doing a tribute of him. Actually, not a tribute. We're going to talk about what it means to be a rabbi traditionally. But the week after that, we're going to move into the 19th century, the real modern era, and we'll talk about what those movements were, because both Germany and Russia, Poland were two distinct movements to America, but also to Palestine. Yes, Holly? Were you gonna say
I have
something?
two sides of my family. One came from Austria-Hungary and Germany in the 1860s, and they were educated and came with some means. That was my mother's side. My father's side came from the Odessa area, we think, and my grandfather from a little town called Spola in the very early 1900s.
20th century. All right, right. And we'll be getting to that as well. Yes, Canner? Unmute. Unmute, Canner.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I hear you now.
My great-grandfather was a businessman in a little town called, a little shtetl, I guess, called Markovich, which was destroyed in the Nazi era. But this was back around the turn of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
And he had a duck pond and a flour mill and a tavern. And his businesses kept getting confiscated. Markovich was near Kiev in what is now Ukraine. So because they kept getting, their businesses kept getting confiscated, they figured out how to leave, and they kind of went to Hamburg and
Right.
took a boat. And my grandfather got bar mitzvahed on the boat, and they wound up in Lawrence, Massachusetts.
Well, so that'll also be part of the story of the 19th and 20th century, right? How, so we got Holly, we got Cantor, we got Mark. Who else wants to? Yes, Steve?
So I have, on the father's side, a grandfather who actually came from Kiev. He was Ukrainian, and his wife came from Poland. And then on my mother's side, they actually came from the UK.
So, okay, also from the UK. Interesting, we have both. And Linda, I see your hand.
Yes, my grandfather came from on my father's side in 1897 from a shtetl, and he came to America because the rabbi had gone to, I think, Minnesota, and opened the door because he said that he would accept my grandfather. Because if you couldn't get into the country, if the country thought you were going to be a burden.
Right.
So he came and went to Minnesota, but he was a peddler, and
Right.
he began with a horse and a wagon and selling clothes and other things. And my other grandfather also came, but he came in early 1900s from a shtetl in the Pale. And because of the pogroms. So that was mine. And Les is what your.
Well, a lot of our belief, I mean, within my family and all, is that perhaps a little too simple, but that human beings forget about what they're called in religion, that all human beings have a need for a Jew, someone to express human hostility toward. So it's a pessimistic point of view, which
But what about your grandparents? How did they? When did your father come here?
1900.
1900. Okay.
Also 1900s. And by the way, what he just expressed is what Sartre wrote in Jew and Non-Jew. Sartre said that if the Jew didn't exist, the non-Jew would have to invent him. I mean, it's really interesting about that. How about Gail? You want to, or Norma?
Share. My
Okay, Gail
grandmother.
and then Norma. Wait, Norma, you're not. You're on mute. Go on.
Oh,
Gail.
Okay, on my father's side, his mother left Poland at a very young age and came here in the 1900s, and actually worked for a man who owned a poultry farm in upstate New York. And she ended up purchasing that farm and making it into a poultry farm as well as a rooming house. And my mother went to work there one summer, and that's where she met my father.
Uh-huh.
I lived on that farm when I was young for about a year, and it's now on the National Historic Site in upstate New York.
Mazel tov.
And let's see, my mother's side came from Poland. in the
Awesome.
early 1900s.
Norma?
Okay. My mother's family came from Poland and my father's family from Germany. And they met in Luxembourg, where I was born. And my mother and I came to this country in 1942.
Okay, and Craig, you want to share with your family?
Yeah, on my father's side, the family came from Ukraine. They're Hungarian background, and my parents are not around many years. I wish I would have asked more of these questions, but I've gone through ancestry.com and a lot of my family filling out dates for me, and that's very helpful. But a lot of the family came from Russia, Poland, Ukraine, that whole area. And I'm going back to great grandparents,
Right.
1800s, and
Yeah.
acquiring incredible documents.
Right.
It's
Yeah,
fascinating.
it's this whole period, and you can see how much movement was going on in the early modern period and why it was going on. And so it's also why so many records don't exist. In certain areas, the records are really good. But in a lot of areas, a lot got destroyed, a lot got moved around, a lot got burned. There were wars going on all the time. When we were in school and we were studying, England and France, it seemed like they were always at war, right? And it's not just in Shakespeare's plays, but they're always at war. There's the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses. There were wars going on all the time, right? But that was going on everywhere in Europe. It was going on in Eastern Europe. Poland was constantly shifting borders. Hungary, everything was shifting borders because everything was about conquest, because the more land you owned, the wealthier you could be if you're an aristocrat. In that whole system, you wanted to have more if you were wealthy. And for the peasants who were working the land, it was irrelevant because they were going to get taxed one way or another. That's the system they believed in. If you were a soldier, you were going to go wherever you were told to go. But the people who controlled it, the aristocrats, they were constantly looking at getting more. And part of the problem they had is the human nature to want to compete with your neighbor. So your neighbor gets, you have a Ford and your neighbor gets a Pontiac. You might want a Pontiac, or maybe you want a Buick. Your neighbor gets a Cadillac. You might want a BMW, or, it's what happened in the feudal system. You can earn more money, but in that system, the only way you could earn more money was have more land, or you had to borrow it. Who are you going to borrow it from? Well, you're going to borrow it from Jews. What do you do when you have to pay back those Jews? Well, you either are going to pay it back, or you're going to kick them out of the country and cancel the debts, which is the way France dealt with it during the 14th century. But now you're in a spot. You still want to get the Cadillac. You haven't been able to conquer any more land. You need to borrow money. Who are you going to borrow it from? You got to invite the Jews back in. Now the Jews come in, but they charge you higher interest because they remember. Well, you still need to borrow, so you borrow. And for 20 or 30 years, things work out okay, but now the Jews need to be paid back. And the cycle continues. Eventually, Jews stopped going to France. Now, some Jewish communities stayed there, the ones that could make a living and could figure it out. But Jews would move to Hungary, or they'd move to eventually Poland, or they'd move to Belgium. They moved wherever they could until they could find some kind of stability for a while. And when we get to the modern era, Jews began, as we see with our own families, to make choices that they never could have made 3 or 4 generations before. And in our generation, if we ask our children, right, where they live, who they married, where they came from, now we're in the world of all choices. We can stay connected to our family electronically, no matter where in the world they are. Again, that's very new. We are in a world of increasing choices, but what I've laid out is that's exactly what modernity is. That's what it was about when the printing press began. The computer and technology is an extension of the printing press. It's faster, but it's the same notion. You couldn't control the printing press either, by the way. People printed what they wanted to print, and they distributed the flyers that they wanted to distribute. That's why there were revolutions, because the government couldn't control them. We have the same issues in our world. Our world is inundated with technology giving us false information. And now we have AI, where we can create images of people who will speak to us who are not real and say things that are not real that will sound authoritative. And struggling with this is all part of the modern era. That's the curse. The blessing is that we have all the choices in the world in order to decide how to live our lives. And as Jews, it's why I've said this, and I will continue to say it, I believe, till I die. There has never been a better period to be Jewish than today. There has never been a stronger Jewish world. There has never been a stronger community of Jews in diaspora. There has never been a more powerful Jewish state. We have more than any Jewish community has ever had anywhere. And we've had it for a longer period than any other community. And there's no reason that it won't continue. There may be, if we think of the relative threats to our community, the real threats are the world. Nuclear, right? Environmental, biological. They're not Jewish threats. They're world threats. The same threats would affect us that affect everybody else. But we have tools to survive, and we're as strong as anyone in the world to survive. And we make choices. We can go anywhere to live if we want. None of our grandparents had choices to go anywhere. They had a few because they lived in the modern era. We have almost an infinite number of choices. If it's finite, it's a large number of finite choices. Okay, so next week, we're going to take a week off for me to do something to tribute to Rabbi Kronish and the rabbis. And then we have 3 more sessions. They will all focus. The next one will be on the 19th and 20th, early 20th. The one after that will be on Zionism. And the one after that will really be on modern Judaisms in the 20th and 21st centuries. So I wish you a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbat.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Rabbi.
you.
As well.
Rabbi, the thing you're going to be doing on Rabbi Kronish, is that where, when, and is it open to the public?
It's open, and it will have a link on the website, and it will be sent out in the weekly email. And you don't have to register. There's no material that you're going to receive for that. So you get a week off from reading.
So that's next Thursday night.
Next
Thursday.
night, yeah.
Yeah.
It's around his yard site.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good night.
All right, thank you.